Junot Díaz. Narodil se roku 1960.
Was born in 1968 in Dominican Republic, but he has lived in the United States since he was 6 years old. This dual experience is the background of all his work. He has been awarded the Pulitzer Prize. He lives in Cambridge in the state of Massachusetts.
Tomáš Kafka.
Tomáš Kafka studied here in Prague at Charles University, but he started his career as a diplomat. At the moment, he is our ambassador to Ireland. He translates from German, he writes plays and books and also micro-stories for children. Constantine Kokossis graduated from the university in Athens, where he studied law. Then he pursued his studies in Brussels, where he studied foreign affairs. Constantine Kokossis is very self-critical. He always is full of sarcasm, and he always speaks about the heroes of his novels. At the moment, he is Greek ambassador to the Czech Republic.
Saadi Yousef.
Saadi Yousef was born in 1934 in Basra in Iraq. Due to the censorship, thanks to the fact that he was always longing for more poetry, he lives in London and he also works in London.
Thank you.
Děkuji. This conversation on the topic of how hot was the Cold War is being moderated by Mr. Pehe. Mr. Pehe has written 2 books, 2 novels. He studied philosophy and law here at Charles University. In 1981, he left the country for the United States, where he graduated from Columbia University in New York. Jiří Pehe also worked as advisor to Václav Havel when he was president, and he is also the chancellor of the New York University here in Prague. He writes commentary on all topical issues.
Dobrý večer.
Good evening.
Tonight's conversation is, I would say, hopefully, at least partly, meant as a mischief, because I think that how hot was the Cold War invites us to kind of discussion that perhaps will make us look at that period with some humor. Well, how hot was the Cold War? I think that it really depends on where we were at the time, from which point we were looking at the Cold War. I think that the Cold War was in a way specific because a specific war because the real wars, real battlegrounds were on the periphery. So if you lived in Vietnam or Cambodia or Angola, you were part of real wars. But I think that the 2 main protagonists, the USA and the Soviet Union, came closest to the war in 1961 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it's roughly 50 years from now. I think we've celebrated or commemorated the anniversary of that event. And again, I think that much depends on where people lived and how they experienced this period. But the Cold War was not just a war of armies and politics, but it was a war of ideas and cultural concepts. And I think from that point of view, it ended long enough before 1989, before the fall of the Berlin Wall, because I think that the ideas behind the Soviet communism were at their peak in the 1950s maybe, and then very quickly the soft power of Soviet communism disappeared, and I think it was completely dead after 1968, the invasion of Czechoslovakia. And when we talk about how hot the Cold War was, we should, of course, not leave out the culture as such. I think that the Cold War produced some amazing literature, films, drama, on both sides of the divide. And at least in this part of the world, we still, I think, have not surpassed the filmmakers and writers and playwrights who created their first works in the 60s and during the dissident era. And certainly there was a good reason for it. And finally, and this is what I would like to ask our panelists to talk about, is a certain kind of nostalgia that is with us for that period. Everything seemed to be clear-cut, black and white. It was, at least in the Western world and in the Soviet bloc, a stable period. And I think that many people come back to that period today looking for some kind of stability, which they cannot find in this rather turbulent global world with its many crises that we see today. So these are my opening remarks, and maybe I would start with you, the ambassador, to say a few words of your own on this.
Thank you, dear. I cannot resist citing, since there was already a reference, Nazim Hikmet, this great Turkish poet. He wrote, and he was in prison in those days, that this world will grow cold one day. Mind you, it was 1948. And I think you can rightfully say that it was the starting point of this period. In Greece, in my country, unfortunately, following the World War II, immediately afterwards, we plunged into a worse calamity, which was the Civil War. And on top of that, you had the Cold War. So if you ask me as a Greek how hot the Cold War was, I can tell you quite genuinely, it was boiling hot. Yes, first, summons recollect this iron-cast silence which was imposed on the eastern part of Europe. The other parts of the globe, there you had antagonisms, I think, fomenting these simmering rifts. Conflicts were erupting like volcanoes one day after the other. They were so to say, a kind of testing ground for coup d'etats, for massively migrating populations, revolutions, invasions, unbridled nationalism. I would say also there was stories about religious fundamentalism, outreaching communism, and so many other isms in those days. But nonetheless, we witnessed a phenomena overseas, which quite strangely enough, and to our sole detriment, I have to say, we experienced in late 80s, which means immediately after what we labeled as the end of the Cold War. And there you had we witnessed ruling elites, political elites, aspiring to decompose their societies. You had also the peoples to fight until the very last ditch. And also, I think that you have theories trying to excuse or demonize ill-perceived theories, and the worst of that, it was that you had the policies exploiting the animosities or even capitalizing on the ignorance or the lack of understanding. And that was something which was really very, very bad. So in sum, you could say that there was the very bad aspect of that. But this is, I think, one side of the coin, because there was another one, if I may. And in what we called in those days the Western world, I think you had, we have experienced a kind of prosperity, a development. To a certain extent, that was mainly the reason why you have this, how to say, curtain, iron curtain, between the one world and the other. Of course, you had the so-called, into inverted commas, security, but it was a kind of security, oh, the bombs are left, with the possibility of mutual destructive, massively destructive means. And this was also very characteristic for that period. And on the other hand, you had another tendency from the political elites, don't overdo that very much. Accept imposed limits, accept impose restraints. And of course, you had always big brothers watching. And sometimes after watching, they intervened indeed in a very lethal way. And someone's experienced that very badly. Though, if I may, since you mentioned this nostalgic approach concerning literature and the theoretical or philosophical aspect of the Cold War, I have to say that, and if I may allow you to use some Greek words here, we spotted a kind of paradox, because during the Cold War, the men were expressing their feelings, their thoughts, I would say in a more symbolic way, with metaphors, with symbolism. It was, to my mind, a nobler way, and that was much nobler than, more vociferous than it is in nowadays. In nowadays, I think, and here you don't have any contradiction, because you needed to have this median line. You needed to have this golden line in behaving. Later on, for instance, when Cold War was over and the light was fused and the boiler erupted, we see what we did see. For instance, in Yugoslavia, which is the backyard of our area, or what it is with these overheated Middle East, or even Central Asia, with unlimited wars, and now we have many more lost lives than in those days. Before closing, because I don't want to monopolize this first intervention, allow me once again to repeat this perennial question. When literature, with big L, seems to be in a better shape, is it under, for instance, restrictions, or is it under prohibitions, or in a free, frivolous, to say word, with unlimited potential, as it appears to be nowadays? Where is the real due level for education? Look what happens here with all these squeezed budget in Europe and in other parts of the world about education, culture. with all due respect to the political personality assisting in this gathering. In other words, when was better for the man to enable man standing next to him to be helpful for the man in need? Please don't ask for my reply, because I can use one word very well known to my profession. No comment, please. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Tomáš Kafka.
I'll try to be very short. Now, in my view, the whole Cold War is shrinking so to just very superficial sensation. It was an unexpected happy end 21 years ago or 22 years ago. And maybe it is bringing us so to a kind of temptation so to perceive the whole Cold War as 40-year-long bad drama, which finally led to a very nice happy end. And in German there is a phrase, when the end is good, then everything is good. And perhaps that's also the reason why we are discussing the Cold War, so because the end was good. Otherwise, my aspect, one maybe which I wish yet to add, is that personally seeing the Cold War, maybe for somebody like me, who lived in the socialist bloc, and it was not so much important whether I was forced to wear the socialist jersey or it was free willingly. It was a kind of fact. There were maybe some oppositionals and some heroes who fought the system, but the rest, the majority, was somehow constrained or reserved and much more struggling with its own jersey than with the situation outside of our socialist bloc. And in this respect, I could have been just very much grateful that the other part of the Cold War, the Western world, was a good enemy, which not only set up some standards where we could somehow look up to them, but also maintain some qualities and values where we could, after '89, start somehow to put them in practice here. Maybe we were not so successful as we wished to be, but maybe it is something so what is worthy of mentioning, so to say, thank you so to the Western world that there was a chance so to come back to something where we, regardless what was the reason, but we were somehow leaving, or we left this space, and then it was nice so to come back.
Thank you. Well, the end was good, all is good, but I think some of us would argue that we are still living with the legacy of the Cold War, and maybe it has not ended. It has taken on new forms. We are talking about war on terrorism or clash of civilizations and many other things. Maybe the war in Yugoslavia that you mentioned was also actually a product of Cold War, belated, but I think was partly still a result of the Cold War. Mr. Yousef, what is your view?
Well, really, I want to mention how the Cold War affected in a certain way the destiny and the whole life of a young man. That young man, that's me. Well, in 1957, Iraq was a monarchy under British influence. That time, as a young man, I ventured to go to a youth festival in Moscow. Well, after the 2 weeks of the festival, it wasn't possible for me to go back to my country because I will be arrested immediately. So I lived in Lebanon, in Syria, in Kuwait. Then in 1958, monarchy was abolished and the Iraqi Republic was proclaimed. Well, I went back to Iraq and worked. Then that new republic, I mean, political prisoners were released. There was an agrarian reform, press, freedom of press, and so and parties. Then after, and the nationalization of petrol, that in 1960, that time John Fitzgerald Kennedy was president. Then, in a famous directive, John Fitzgerald Kennedy said, remove him. What remove him? That's the Iraq Prime Minister. And then, in 1963, there was a coup d'etat triggered by John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and the Ba'athists came to power in Iraq for the first time. And then everything changed, including me. I was imprisoned by the Ba'athists in 1963. I was released after another coup d'etat between the parties. Then I went to exile again. I worked in Algeria for about 7 years. So really, you know, till now, I am outside my country. For 33 years, I am not in my country. And that's all, I think. Cold War affected my life in this way, as an individual. Then what we can say about millions and millions of people under that impact of the Cold War. Well, just a personal story.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Díaz.
Yeah, I'd kind of like to meet who selected this topic for the festival. It's like kind of sadistic, yeah? Not because it's not real, but it's very weird. I guess first, thank you all for coming out, and thank you for having me. And I wanted to thank my colleagues here and our interlocutor. I guess to give any kind of an answer, I mean, it is such an enormous topic. It's sort of like discussing a dragon the size of the world, and we're all just going to talk about which scale we saw. I guess from my perspective, I can begin with sort of just the Latin American perspective. I think that, as most of us know, Latin America was considered part of the West, but the Cold War really unleashed across Latin America enormous energies, and that it also triggered a cascade of horrors across the continent, whether we're talking about the dictatorships that were put into power sort of to protect and to consolidate American interests, whether we're talking about Chile, we're talking about Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil. We're also talking about revolutionary or rebel movements that came up, that the two sides costing the lives of tens of thousands of people. We're talking about genocidal wars in Guatemala. I mean, even the the United Nations has designated the wars in Guatemala as genocidal. And the United Nations, it takes a long time for them to ever use that word. Yeah. we saw an enormous amount of violence, displacements of people, coup d'etats, and I think that this was a large trauma for Latin America that continues to haunt it. If you're in Argentina, you have some of the children of the wealthiest families have turned out to be the children of the disappeared. That, you know, their parents were tortured leftist sort of radicals, and the kids were adopted by wealthy elites. And from my own personal perspective, I'm from the Dominican Republic. Dominican immigration to the United States was a byproduct of the Cold War. A coup d'etat against a sort of constitutional democratic movement by the United States, an invasion and an occupation in 1965 guaranteed that 1 million Dominicans would end up living in the very country that made their democracy impossible, which is one of the great ironies of sort of global politics. In my own childhood, of course, I was a kid who grew up in what would be called the late Cold War, if we can designate a period, in the United States. If you came up the way I did, it meant that you were part of that captive sort of camp in the West, which was terrorized by the fear of nuclear war, but who also had to produce, you know, sort of in like the Greek legends, you had to produce tributes to feed to the Minotaur, so that almost everyone's family, if you were a poor kid like mine, had to give up children to be soldiers. So I had a brother who was in the military, 2 cousins who were in the military, and it was very much a project that involved both scaring the fuck out of people and also making sure, at least the United States side, that there was a lot of bodies in uniforms. And I think what was interesting about it, at least from a child perspective, is that, or a young man's perspective, is that at this period also, because both of the opposing camps were trying to sort of energize their projects, there was an enormous amount of utopian discourse, whether it was a socialist utopia or whether it was a capitalist utopia. But what was fascinating was that a lot of artists and a lot of activists on both sides were attempting to create alternate utopias. And this was a moment where it was possible to dream of a better tomorrow. Even if you were from sort of a diabolical capitalist camp, you were like, aha, a better tomorrow will be everybody's in a fucking factory. You know, that's great. But utopia was a possibility. And I think one of the things that was so interesting about what happened with the end dique, as we say in Spanish, of the Cold War, was the demolition of any utopian project, whether socialist or capitalist or alternate. It seems that utopias are discredited. I mean, it's one of those things that I think is really fascinating, because for all the horrors and the difficulties of the Cold War, our human resistance, what all of us did, whether you were being imprisoned or whether you were participating or whether you were just on the margins, you know, this terrible clash allowed people to dream in a way. Now, I'm not saying was it worth it or not, that was not what I'm trying to get at, but that at least at this moment, when I was a young man growing up in the United States and I had siblings in the military, I could say a utopia was a possibility. But my young students now, I teach at a university, and utopia is even more discredited than Marxism. Utopia is the most discredited thing in the world. And it's as if the first thing the capitalists did when they won was to put away those big dreams which they used to keep people in uniforms. Because those very big dreams are incredibly dangerous. And I think that that's, for me, besides the bodies, the suffering, the tortures, the coup d'etats, the prisoners, the real victim was our ability to dream in certain ways. And I think that's what I kind of lament, you know?
Well, thank you very much. What you said about utopia is, I think, very, very important. What has survived then? What is the legacy of the Cold War? One central idea that seemed to be on the winning side of the Cold War was human rights and freedom. And it seems that human rights today are to some extent also treated as a utopia, and that what has really prevailed in this new system after the fall of communism, of the fall of the Berlin Wall, is what you called victory of capitalism, with one central idea, and that seems to be consumerism. So, what is the legacy? What is the legacy of the Cold War, and what was the reason for winning it? If we are now lamenting the current situation.
I think it's too early to make any kind of assessment. Of course, you can enjoy the fact that you got this very limited room of personal and civilian rights, and which were omitted from a very important part of what you can call as Eurasia. But on the other hand, if you see that globally, you see that you have the spillovers even within the society, because in our days we speak about the newly impoverished populations, which have enshrined rights in constitutions, but in real life they are omitted and they are short of any kind of basic rights, apart from the very theoretical which are enshrined into the documents, papers, declarations, etc., etc. So where is the social sensitivity about what was gained and achieved through the collapse of the Berlin Wall, to put that in a very simplistic way? So we need more time, I think, and we have also to take into account that in history, the pendulum of the history goes from the one extreme side to the other side. So in order to reach what I said before, median line, you needed time. And of course, another dimension is that the world, yes, it takes a village. We need to see that globally in, I would say, world scale, and not just isolated, as it, or even split or halved as it was during the Cold War. This is my approach.
Well, is there, in this rather confused situation, is there some nostalgia for that period?
Of course, I would say so. We are now experiencing a huge change of the paradigm. It was mentioned by Junot that it was one of the privileges of Cold War. It was this freedom to dream, the freedom to have some utopia, because the future seemed very lucrative or attractive. Now it's a change, so we are very much so afraid of the future, but instead of it, we are now gonna to idolize perhaps the past. So that's maybe one of the reasons I'm detecting, so why we are discussing here this topic, so because it's somehow sexy to speak about the Cold War. Maybe 20 years ago, it will be a hot topic. Today it is rather something so more fashionable. And I wish to come back also very quickly to the topic whether just so the capitalism as the only one side won the Cold War and now it's just so abandoning itself due to the lack of any competition. I'm not so sure. I'm rather so prone to see something like a kind of globalization which is undergoing absolutely stunning metamorphosis. It is getting more and more bigger. The role of the politicians compared to the time of the Cold War is minimized. The politicians are occasionally even just redundant. It's maybe a kind of privilege to have politicians, not so a kind of necessity. And in this respect, I would say maybe one day we will look at the European Union and the whole development within this still very interesting and valuable community. And maybe one day we will look for a kind of parallel between the communism with the human face and globalization with the human face. Maybe it's another experiment how to create a new competition that even the globalization could be experienced differently. But that's maybe one of the little privileges which the future may bring. So because now everybody of us is absolutely scared because of the future.
We know how communism with the human face ended, at least in this country. But Mr. Yousef, what are, in your opinion, ideals that have survived and the test of time, and you would see them as the legacy of the Cold War?
Well, now I think I am out of that all nowadays. I am interested in poetry only, writing poetry. I am no more interested in politics. After all the suffering of decades of suffering with politics. Thank
you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Díaz, what about writers in this post-Cold War period? It seems that the Cold War was, when it comes to writers and cultural figures, a very benign period in a way. I mean, we touched on that. I think that the number of really excellent works of literature, film, drama, and so on, which were produced in the 60s and 70s, are still unsurpassed today. So what has happened to literature and culture in this post-Cold War period when we have supposedly all of this freedom to use?
Again, this is very particular to each country. I think that the specificity of any nation's literature requires an enormous amount of erudition to talk about in any useful way. I can look, what I can speak to is simply this, that when we think about Latin America, you know that Borges, you know how he has these dream libraries in some of his stories? Yeah, library figures into many of Borges' stories. And in Latin America, during the Cold War, they murdered so many writers. I mean, they murdered entire national literatures. I mean, Guatemala just wiped out all its writers. Chile and Argentina and Uruguay kidnapped, disappeared, and buried thousands of poets. You know, if you were stupid enough to write a sonnet in Argentina during a certain amount of time, you were certainly going to be gone. And I think for me, one of the things is when I think about what we're talking about, in my mind, I have a library of all the books that could have been written, all the novels that could have been written, all the poetry that could have been written, all the dance that could have been written. I think the problem with the living is that they scarcely ever think about the dead. And the library to the dead, I think, stands as a sort of reminder of the enormous costs of this. And in many ways, when we say, like, what's going on with literature, we must remember that just we're talking about a state in the world where everybody's imagination is captured. I mean, does anybody have time to read? I mean, I'm so busy being told to go buy shit. It's like, I mean, who the hell has time to read? If I'm not on Facebook or on my phone, you know, it's really difficult. And I think that for me, my sense of what has happened, of where an artist has to be, is an artist is aware of this past, because what we're being told these days is to stay completely in the present. When folks were being told about being scared of the future, there's a reason the future has been eliminated as a concept. There's a reason most people are disconnected from a past. I mean, the critic Harold Innis talked about this, that one of the things capitalism really loves is to keep people in a permanent hysterical present. And therefore, you're very vulnerable to any kind of manipulation. If you can't lean on a past and you can't dream about a future, you're an easy person to push around. And I do think we've been moved wholesale as a civilization, slowly but surely, into a permanent hysterical present, and that the past has collapsed and the future looks ominous. And they've done this to us under the cover of everything. And as an artist, for me, the one thing I try to do is to try to maintain the possibility that there is a past and there is a future. Because I'm being told to live in this one space, and we were not meant to just live in the present, you guys. That's not our ontological vocation. We are meant to live at least in those dimensions of past, present, and future. And it's been very lonely. And as a writer, you try to remember that the house has these other rooms, even if no one else does.
And it definitely... In a paradoxical way, it definitely seems to be much more difficult to capture what you just described in literature than, for example, the gulags that some writers wrote about during the Cold War. Everything seemed to be much more black and white and more connected to values which could be captured. Well, the audience cannot see that, but I can. There is this little box here which shows time that we had, and it's been at 0 for some time. So I think we have to finish. I am glad that we survived, all of us, not only the Cold War but also this imitation of the Cold War above us, and the bomb wasn't dropped on us. And I would like to thank all of the panelists for coming coming here and sharing their ideas with us. And we will see them during the festival this week. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
It's a great. Thank you.